For lots of people, UFOs are still this abstract, spiritual, almost sci-fi thought experiment. But if non-human intelligences are actually here, operating clandestinely, abducting people, seeding technology, and possibly even shaping our belief systems, that's not just an interesting mystery. That's a civilizational problem we have to think clearly about. In this conversation, Reed Summers and I treat the phenomenon as something real, physical, and now. We talk about UAP detection and tracking, why the oceans matter, abductions as the clearest window into intent, technological gifts that may not be gifts, and how NHI might be quietly engineering our narratives while staying in the shadows. We also get into what a human first response could look like, stability, security, and sovereignty, and why Reed thinks contact might be a unifier, but disclosure could be the divider if we get it wrong. With that, here's my 90-minute deep dive with Reed Summers. Reed Summers, the first question I would ask you is, why are you so involved in the conversation right now? What fueled you to become so involved in discussing the transformation we've started having since the December 16th, 2017 New York Times article published?
Well, it's been a long journey, and I've been involved in this in some way or fashion most of my life. My family's been deeply involved for a long time, so I think I've always been aware, looking, asking questions, talking to people about the phenomenon. I remember spending 4 hours with Dr. David Jacobs 21 years ago in his office at Temple University talking about, his research. And so it's been a long journey, and I've been looking at it for a long time. I think, the 2023 hearings in Congress, David Grush, Ryan Graves, and David Frazier was a milestone for me. That was a new high watermark. And then I actually think the Seoul conference that fall, the first Seoul symposium, in which, again, high-level former agency directors, scientists, government officials were speaking on this, just told me that this is broken out of the encirclement. It's broken out of the bounds of what's kept it in the fringe, and it's now rushing into society, and I have to be a part of that. And I actually, frankly, felt a spontaneous sense of calling to just get involved and to say what I know in the way I know to say it. And I've just been working on kind of fulfilling that ever since.
Awesome. I mean, I think I did, I don't think I know. I did one UFO video about a year before the October 11th, 2017 news conference that To the Stars Academy put on. So I've always been interested in the topic, but once that conference happened, or whatever you want to call it, news event happened with To the Stars Academy, I was obsessed. And from the very beginning, I wanted to influence the conversation. I'll just be honest. There's a lot of voices in it, and I wanted my voice to be part of what influences the environment of this topic. I want to ask you a question. Yeah. You recently launched the UAP Detection and Tracking Summit. Tell me what that's all about and why is it important?
Yeah, well, I'm on the organizing committee for the conference. I will be a co-chair of the summit. And so yes, what it is, it's a 2-day virtual conference next February 7th and 8th, laser focused on finding ways that society can detect and track UAP technologically at the level of fundamental science and sensor networks and the detectable signatures of UAP, to converge the roughly 10 or 12 groups that are already doing this globally into a nascent coalition of detection and tracking, research, academic, and technology teams, and generate key insights for society without relying on government, willingness to give us information. Go generate the information ourselves to gain better insight into what is flying over our skies, in our skies, over our cities, over our coastlines, and sensitive infrastructure. So it's really about society coming together to generate its own capabilities toward territorial sovereignty, aerial intelligence, and public safety in light of, all of this anomalous activity flying above us, doing things we don't understand. And so, it's been a very exciting process to launch the conference. We have Congressman Eric Burleson giving the first talk. We have a keynote by James Fowler, formerly of Skywatcher. Dr. Gary Nolan will be talking about the Skywatcher Discovery Framework. We have technological and institutional leads from a variety of UAP organizations, including the SCU, the Society for UAP Studies, and others, speaking on what it would take fundamentally to detect UAP reliably, to converge different data sets from different organizations and provide an open access, research accessible database of UAP findings for the public.
Yeah, that actually makes so much rational sense, because if there are craft coming in and out of our oceans, coming into our atmosphere from space and going back into space, I mean, I think there's a very good argument to be made that that does not belong just to the military or the government. That should be looked at by civilian operations or programs, because it's relevant to everybody. It's not just a military sensitive reality. It's a human population sensitive reality, I would argue. And with that, absolutely. Because this relates to it, one of the interesting parts of the Age of Disclosure is where it was discussed intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR.
Right.
And it was conveyed that this is a very common way that UFOs operate in our world. They are seen by military operations and installations disproportionately, it appears, to other places. And I mean, ultimately, we can only speculate as to why that is, because these non-human intelligences don't communicate to us, at least openly. Why do you think it's significant that they do appear to be engaging in ISR?
Well, yes, from the beginning of the phenomenon, in the late 1940s, early 50s, there seemed to be a extreme interest in our, quote, tip of the spear technologies, as has been described. So, our nuclear power generating facilities, nuclear weapons, manufacturing facilities, storage, forward deployment bases, etc. Basically monitoring the nature of our technological advances, broadly speaking, as a civilization, but also how those are being used functionally in weaponized form in conflict zones, and the ever-shifting nature of the balance of power in the world. So it wouldn't surprise me if a non-human intelligent form of life were to detect us, which could have happened a long time ago or more recently. For example, by flashing the universe with 2,000 nuclear detonations, that'll do it. Unique techno and biosignatures that we've been putting off for quite some time. If they were to come, engage in a process of observation, test our abilities, test our responses to their abilities, and understand by collecting tremendous amounts of data and generating some sort of technological system that can predict human behavior, find ways that they can ultimately alter, adjust our human trajectory, civilizationally, technologically, but also find ways of potentially integrating with humanity technologically. And so this is where we get into, the potential scenarios of overall intent, which is the top focus of my work, is basically looking at motive and intent using indicators and signals in the behavioral record, as well as human-centered first principles thinking to examine, what are the most plausible scenarios among the vast array of possible scenarios. So there's a lot of work we can do there with just base logic and reason, but also with observation to better understand why, to your question, Ryan, why would they want to be doing some form of intelligence gathering, surveilling of abilities, capabilities, and reconnaissance, right? So if they are doing that, that suggests to me that this is not a remote observational presence. This is a down and in attempt to fundamentally affect, influence, or even alter or co-opt our process of development as a species. And so, observing our tip of the spear technologies would be one way, and potentially influencing them to readjust the course of humanity as it takes shape.
Yeah, and I think you fulfill a void in the conversation within the UFO community, because you're so practical and down to earth when you look at the topic. There's so many people that go into the esoteric possibilities, the spiritual possibilities, and that kind of line of thinking. But you're very I think that your approach is very down to earth and in a conversation that we need to have, because a lot of people are not looking at like what are they doing here and what can we discern about why we're doing it. It's almost like they avoid that question, which I find very interesting.
I do too, honestly, and that's part of what got me into this. Is I was looking at the state of the conversation, basically just flicking the X feed on this topic, and seeing a lot of wishful thinking, bad logic, really irresponsible assumption, kind of just running the conversation, plus a lot of belief, a lot of fear and hope, and the projection of human spiritual kind of notions and belief systems onto what is potentially our encounter with the non-human reality that encircles, our world. And so it's like, man, how is the public ever going to get into this conversation if this is the state of thinking? So to elevate that state of thinking and to give the public a basic kind of framework to approach this, engaging their full set of capabilities with logic, reason, caution, responsibility, history, observations of UAP activity, and kind of composing that in a structured cognitive process. That's really been my focus. And basically help people to think through this. It's not about what to think, it's about how to be thinking at this point. And if there are structured craft of non-human origin operating in the sky, on land, and in the oceans, having real effects on not only governments and defense companies and agencies, but the human population at large, and the effect is, multivariate, then we need to seriously deal with that on a different time scale and to a different degree than we would our exploration of the possibilities of the universe writ large. And so if we're dealing with something that is physical, technological, and now, as we're beginning to understand, biological, right? That should precondition our at least initial approach to this phenomenon, anchored in our understanding of nature, evolution, competitive dynamics between species. And I believe that is really the grounds for a common or collective human response to this. If you have a Judeo-Christian centered framework and you're going to respond to this and that, well, that's going to, put off a vast section of humanity. If you've got a purely, a disposition of any religious or even secular orientation that's not nature, science, data, observation, right, driven, then you are placing this on a platform that only a small subset of humanity could ever join you in. So, what is the grounds for a collective and preferably united human response to this presence? That's really top of my mind.
So, if you look in history, explorers have gone to new lands, taken over new lands, colonized new lands. So we do it to each other, if you will. Do you think that, assuming these non-human intelligences come from other star systems, do you think that there will ever come a time where we kind of have to coexist and figure out what that's going to look like? Because we don't know how long they've been here. That's an open debate. Have they been here for millennia? Did they just start coming when we started developing nuclear weapons? I mean, that's an open debate. I don't have a dog in the fight. I like to listen to everybody. Mm-hmm. It does appear they're very attracted to our oceans. It seems like they like to reside there. I mean, the most highly probable reason for that could be it gives them good cover because they're not initiating open contact yet they still want to be here. Do you think there's ever going to be a realization by humanity that we just have to coexist and figure out how we're going to do that without stepping on each other's toes?
I do. The question is, how will we prefer that outcome in our response to this phenomenon, especially those who are in the conversation today? It's easy to set up a conversation in which, human and bad, ET good, USG bad, other governments, not so, and create basically a new competitive environment that layers right on top of the longstanding, arms race for technologies of non-human origin that we're hearing about, right? So we humans are great at competing and dividing ourselves. What is the path toward a human coexistence in the context of engaging NHI? That's a critical question. Just to back up for a sec, so I do look at all of the phenomenon myself as well, and I know it is multivariate. It is not only nuts and bolts. It's not only the 5 or 6 observables. There's more to it. I do think there is an extraterrestrial component to the NHI presence, and we have to guard against this category inflation of unidentified anomalous phenomena, non-human intelligence. Right? What are the hard kind of centerline realities that have the greatest impact on human health and interests that we most urgently need to respond to? Focus on those. Don't rule out anything. Don't rule out everything else. Rule those in. It's more of a rule in versus a rule out for me. And in the context of the ETI component, I definitely subscribe to the historical trigger theory, which there were triggering events in the 20th century, unlike any other technologically and globally that had ever occurred before, that triggered a new and modern wave of engagement that is qualitatively, quantitatively distinct from what we might hypothesize as ancient forms of engagement. And so to read a straight line from now until prehistory and say it's all been here all the time, they've been with us all along. Well, who is the they? And how do we even corroborate a claim that they who are here now, if they choose to say so, were they who were here back then, right? So we have to be mentally disciplined. We have to look for patterns, trends, and distinct markers in the history of the phenomenon. There's not a whole lot of utility in the ancient contact narratives to explain what's happening now, right? We can't go back in time and detect what was happening over Renaissance Italy or in the caves of southern France 500,000 years ago. What is the utility, right? Well, we have a ton of utility today. Detection and tracking capabilities are at a point like never before. We can detect and track UAP. The government, as we're hearing, or defense entities are able to effectively down UAP, which is certainly a question of ethics and really makes you question the state of the kinetic engagement. But we're in a modern wave. And so to your question about human coexistence, yes, I think the power of this event is that of a unifier. Contact is a unifier. Disclosure could well be the divider. We will be dividing ourselves over the factional fight for the disclosure narrative, the geopolitical fight over technologies, over and how those can reshape the world and rebalance power. We heard that even in the documentary, that whoever cracks the code first puts themselves in a position of supremacy, right? And so as citizens, as a global community, we have to be highly engaged in influencing the conversation, Ryan, to your point, and protecting certain red lines around what we humans do in light of this, but also what non-humans do with us and in light of this. And NHI they're a horse in the race. They're on the stage as well. It's not just human on human. We cannot assume them to be neutral and removed, purely observational, tacitly supportive. We don't know that. There's so much we don't know. There are dimensions to this phenomenon that have been kept secret because they are deemed impossible to disclose. So we have to ready our nervous systems and put on our real thinking capabilities to suss out those possibilities.
Yeah, my bias, and we don't know, but I don't think they're ever going to leave the Earth. And the reason I come to that analysis is because if they felt so comfortable to do everything they've done, right, which is engage humanity, engage the world, while doing it covertly, that's not the sign of a visitation. They're like, sure, humanity says leave, we're going to leave. Yeah, I don't think they're going to. But eventually, we are going to run into them. And what I mean is, like, most of the ocean has not been researched or tracked. Like more of Mars has been mapped than the ocean, right? But eventually that's going to change. Eventually our technology will get to a point where we can map the whole ocean, and we might come across a lot of weird stuff that it's going to be hard to grapple with.
We're already there. We're already there, and I wouldn't be surprised if control systems are being put in place to prevent domain awareness, to actually blind those with those capabilities from seeing effectively into those spaces.
And when we run into that, then, I think we'll get disclosure long before that, but eventually down the trajectory, we are going to run into it because they're here and they're utilizing Earth. I don't know why they're utilizing Earth. It could be purely scientific. It could have something to do with resources. It could be all of the above. We don't know, but the point is they obviously see this planet as appealing. Otherwise, why would you be here? Assuming they come from other planets. Some people think they come from here. It could be some come from here, some come from other planets. I don't know. I don't have a dog in the fight, and I respect everyone's opinion on that. But either way, I'm not sure it really matters where they come from. The fact is that the bottom line is they probably have interests that may not necessarily align with our interests. And sooner or later, we are going to have open contact, in my opinion. Sooner or later, we're going to have open talks with them. And as uncomfortable or as almost embarrassing as it sounds, we probably should have these discussions, like what we would talk about with them and how we would engage that conversation and how we could attempt to make it mutually beneficial, simply because neither party is probably going to abandon this planet, if I had to guess.
Right. I find it really interesting. You heard it in the documentary as well, that essentially there's a tacit acknowledgement that they can do whatever they want, right? We're basically at their behest. And so we're according them almost unlimited power. And okay, yes, UAP can do phenomenal things in the sky, and they have phenomenal power generating capabilities. Eric Davis, gave the estimate that like a whole year's worth of power generation in the entire United States is what it would take to fuel the maneuvers of these craft, right? So they have these phenomenal capabilities, but we subordinate ourselves. We assume technological superiority means ethical or spiritual superiority. Right. And we put ourselves in this subordinated position. And yet we also imagine if we had these technologies, what we could do: travel the stars, heal the climate crisis. And so it's like we're in the presence of a more powerful force that has not given us that has not disclosed its presence, that operates covertly. And yet we imagine the possibilities of getting what they have. And I think that's a risky kind of semantic environment to exist within, right? Where you want what they have and you're subordinated and can't imagine being able to dictate the terms of the engagement. And so, yes, maybe someday we are offered what they have, but what are the terms of the deal, right? And so to your point, Ryan, I think we're at the point of needing to step out ahead of, is it real? Is there a there? To now acknowledge we're beyond that. Is there a they there? That's really the question. Is there an intelligence, a sentience, a life form? And if so, we need to basically envision a new relational engagement with other life forms and begin to explore how we would negotiate differing intents and purposes. What is the diplomatic kind of framing that humanity would put in place to wisely engage non-human intelligence and to entertain petitions for access, for resources, but to do so in that would benefit us all collectively in a human interest. And so I think, we have to step above the conversation about the U.S. government and the defense community and the legacy program and really see this as the entity encounter that it is for the whole species. And my hope is that this gets driven out of the context of the U.S. military, industrial complex and security state and into the intergovernmental state. To my knowledge, bodies like the United Nations, the European Union, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization have not dealt with this almost at all. I do think that there are individuals within those organizations who know. I don't know anyone who knows how to begin to frame this out and to basically to manage this internationally versus to have each nation manage it on terrestrial, inside their territory. Because if we continue that down the road, North Korea is going to have their crash recovery reverse engineering program, as will China, as will Russia. But then they will begin to have their non-human engagement program, right? Their diplomatic arrangements to transact for technologies, for base science, or for more that we wouldn't even imagine being available. And how does that compromise the global community?
Yeah, and I think you just made one of the best arguments for disclosure that is not widely argued, which is one of the best arguments for disclosure is that this is a global situation, and I mean, we're so inclined to see it as like this esoteric reality that just doesn't really involve us, but it's only relevant to like a few, a few rare experiencers or government programs or aerospace corporations looking at the technology. And we kind of get hypnotized to look at it through that lens. But in reality, this is a situation that is going to involve all world governments and the entire population. And so the fact that it's only really discussed at a high level with smoking gun evidence supporting that conversation is an absurdity. I'd like to get your take on what Dr. Eric Davis, UFO whistleblower David Grush, others have spoken about, and it is in the literature, is the idea that it's not all crashes, even assuming crashes are true crashes, but some of it is landing their craft, presumably so that governments can retrieve them and then study them. And this is reportedly happening in China, Russia, the United States. So there's already we could already argue there's already a collaboration, right? There's already you could argue there's already open contact in a sense, even just at this fundamental level of they land, they have their craft land, knowing governments are going to snatch them and studying them. There's a relationship there. I mean, unfortunately, because there's not open contact, I don't know if government insiders or aerospace corporations have more insight, but unfortunately, because there's not open contact, we really don't know why they're doing this. What are we to make of these alleged landings that might be looked at as donations?
Yeah, well, I think it's time to go beyond the mischaracterization as a blanket statement of crash recoveries. I was happy to see at least Hal Puthoff say it, that he posited this could be an intentionally deposited form of technology. He called it a gift. He surmised maybe this is a giant IQ test for the species. Can they crack the code on this little nugget that we dropped down there? Even if so, I would be concerned about the intent behind the IQ test, right? Because if they're depositing different tech in different places, watching different governments reverse engineer it, they know we will weaponize, we will divide, we will draw up lines to secure power, profit, and prestige from these technologies. They know that. They've been watching. They can scoop up our data. We transmit it into space and have for over 80 years. So why would they be conducting a test like that? It doesn't speak to the kind of benevolent ecologist scenario of intent, right? In that you don't try to influence the wildlife. You watch. You don't want them to see you. You want them to function naturally, organically. Well, we're not functioning naturally or organically anymore. Look at the technological race to AGI with no human control mechanisms, right? It almost looks like an anti-human event shaping up. You hear statements like from the head of OpenAI that he would rather see humanity, I believe it was, humanity no longer exist than AGI not come into being. That is anti-human. What is fueling this dangerous race? It's not just a tech race for, aerial craft, right? 0-point energy, faster than light travel. Is it a race for directed energy weapons, right? Is it a race for capabilities to surveil populations in ways we can not even imagine today, right? So what is the nature of the tech race? That's a question. But I would call it a bit of a red herring to go right to, quote, gift when we think of the depositing of these technologies. There are many different reasons you would deposit them, right? To test, yes, the IQ factor of the species, but also as potentially part of a transaction with different state or non-state actors in exchange for, well, there's many things we could exchange for. Access, population, resources, political cover, access to information spaces in order to influence them. So the way I kind of see this is I take it at the level of an interspecies encounter. Differing intents, planetary interest, probably, right? They're here for the planet or they're here for us. What else is there, right? And I actually I'm not totally convinced we are that valuable or interesting as we might think we are. I think the planet is much more valuable and interesting than we are. So if we are destroying the planet at a rapid rate, using nuclear weapons and potentially altering ecologies on timescales that are very meaningful when you talk about habitation, and gaining also the technological ability to get off planet, to extend power off the Earth, we might be looking at a variety of differing intents to enter the Earth human system, to collaborate, to compete, to integrate, to influence in different ways. And I think depositing technologies in a Trojan fashion, right, either to alter or influence our technological direction as a species, to infuse into the human technosphere key insights that would fundamentally alter the way we relate to technology, to have us over technologize, right, ourselves, could be at play. And also, to potentially put in place, again, systems that we will no longer be able to fully control, but that can be controlled at a distance, off planet, right? If you want to run society, create an artificial, machine-driven system to make decisions and to perform all key functions. At that point, it could be run off planet. I'm not saying it is going to be or is already, but it could be. Whereas how do you govern a world of 7.5 billion unruly humans, right? It's quite challenging. So, I think the technological seeding is a theory that is more plausible to me than truly crash recoveries. And also, I don't doubt that some have crashed, but I don't think they've all crashed naturally. I think some have been shot down effectively. And I think there is something of a cold or even hot war in the skies between some state actors and these NHI forces, and that is at play. And it's time to begin to account for that.
Yeah, and we hear stories or reports of the NHI species not even getting along with each other, having their own friction, which just makes the whole playing field so much more complicated. One of the standout parts of the Age of Disclosure
film. Welcome to nature. Yeah, welcome to nature. Nature's like that.
Yeah. One of the standout parts of the Age of Disclosure for me, and you can correct me if I got any of these details wrong, but I believe it was Dr. Eric Davis said he had a private conversation with George Bush II in 2003. And George Bush told Eric Davis that there, in Holloman Air Force Base, 1964, 3 UAP approached the Air Force Base, the Holloman Air Force Base. One of them landed on the tarmac. An NHI entity deboarded the craft and interacted with uniformed Air Force and civilian CIA personnel. What do you make of that? And I'll just give my little analysis of it quickly. Is I find that if these legacy programs or parts of the Air Force are already interacting directly on this level where they're standing face to face and having conversations, what does that mean for the rest of the world?
Huge. I mean, I'll also call out, Dr. Eric Davis shared again on the documentary, this account of a 1989 Soviet recovery of a Tic Tac UAP object with 4 humanoid alien bodies on board, and that once they took apart the craft, they discovered an advanced directed energy weapon. Those were his words. So we'll have to chew on that and think about what that means as to the connectivity between those two issues, DEW and UAP. I mean, if these craft are landing and interacting on military bases, that's not a neutral act in the world today. You land at a U.S. Air Force base and interact, potentially transact something with them. How do the Chinese and the Russians feel about that, right? Is there another NHI doing the same with them? Are different power centers being equipped with different forms of technology, different capabilities that they would inevitably use to attain, state security and the supremacy of their national security interests? They would, right? And so I at times question the intent based upon the vector of engagement. There's been no, in my mind, credible attempt to notify the whole human population all at once, to basically take out of the hands of the military agencies the cudgel, right? The ability to use information, technology, access to NHI to gain supremacy over their rivals. Rather, there's been an interest in human power centers, engaging them in different ways at different times. And of course, yes, there may be multiple NHI engaging humanity at the same time. But, that kind of deboarding of a craft and interaction on the ground has not only happened with military personnel, right? That has happened with probably, if you take the accounts to be relative, if you accord some truth to the testimonial record, and that some of the patterns that we have seen in that testimony point to a consistent engagement pattern, there are probably thousands or even tens of thousands of civilians who have been engaged on the ground as well. I think of the Ariel school incident. I think of Travis Walton. I mean, there's so many, more than I can even account for, but such a consistently reported characteristic NHI entity and pattern of engagement, right? So I think, we have to do due diligence and pay attention to the citizenry. People are saying that they're having real experiences, not under hypnosis, not dreams, real memories of being physically engaged by NHI and removed from their home, having medical experiments undertaken, without consent, with unknown implications and ramifications. So I think it's highly significant if it is true that non-human entities are deboarding craft interacting with people, both government or non.
Yeah, and I think this illuminates what you just went over. It illuminates how absurd the cover-up is, because it's like there are people allegedly being taken onto craft, and yet the government doesn't want to admit that there's a presence here. I mean, that's baffling. That's a level of absurdity that I don't think there's any word in the English dictionary that could express that sufficiently. But when you were talking about that, I'm thinking of like someone like Travis Walton as an example, who allegedly literally was walking around the craft and coming across various species as he reported. And you got me thinking about how part of the PSYOP from the non-human intelligences is they are, at least how I interpret it, they are intentionally keeping the conversation minimized or isolated. So the way they conduct their operations or engage our world directly facilitates the state of the conversation. And the state of the conversation is, it is being concentrated in governments and aerospace corporations. But then when you look at the broader public, when we have this conversation, it's more fringe, it's debated. That's not, I don't think that is just some kind of happenstance or statistical anomaly. I think the non-human intelligences have orchestrated that intentionally. But at the same time, it gets weird, because it's not like they completely cloak themselves or keep themselves from being seen by the larger population. A great example that you already referenced is like Zimbabwe in the 90s, where there was a school landing and 60 plus witnesses. And then there was West Hall, Australia. I don't remember the date, but that also was a huge school landing. And actually, school landings are not very rare, in the sense that there have been many reported school landings all over the world. So it does seem like they're kind of, I mean, I don't know how they think, and I'm assuming here, but from my perspective, it assumes that on the one hand, they want to keep the conversation small, and they want it to be a little bit fringe outside of the entities that they allow to have better evidence of their presence. But on the other hand, it also seems like they're kind of preparing us for open contact. They're kind of leading us in that direction, which might be why they do these school landings and these bizarre activities. What's your take?
Well, I'll just say this. If at any point there is federal confirmation or affirmation that NHI are present and active, we must immediately put the center of controversy on that NHI presence, because where is all the physical evidence? It's been sucked out of the landscape. It's been removed from our own hands, right? This is not like leave no trace, like again, the benevolent ecologist. This is leave no tracks, right? Because if this has been a multi-decade global engagement program involving potentially tens or even hundreds of thousands of individual human beings, the preponderance of hard evidence is a smoking gun, in my opinion, right? That somebody intentionally kept us from gaining access to, the key pieces of evidence that would flip the evidential circuitry on, that would convince people this is real. And so in a way, I wonder if NHR, they know our little evidence game. They know how hard proof would convince the public, and that's why there is none. It's not just the human, the legacy program, and these greedy, power-hungry, men and women in the legacy program who want to have access to this technology. I really do not think that that's the true nature of the engagement taking place. Yes, to your point, the conversation on this should be global. This should be considered the biggest event in human history that might be taking place. People are curious about it. Everyone I talk to on this topic, I'd say 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 are open. And yet look at where the conversation is. It is in the farthest flung corner of the fringe. Now, there are some good movements to get it out of that. And that's why, thank you, Age of Disclosure, just at that level. Thank you for getting this onto Bill Mayer. Thank you for getting this into Variety magazine. Like small movements, small steps, but important ones. But yeah, I mean, are the NHI both covering up their presence and strategically revealing their presence at key times and in ways that introduce turbulence into the system, right? That potentially compromise the citizen trust in human authority. I think of what happened a year ago, after the UFO hearings in Congress, before the new administration took office, all of this anomalous activity in the sky. It looked a little bit to me like some form of a psychological operation on the population to say, we're here. The government, are you going to disclose? No, of course you're not going to disclose. So you're going to lie. And now the new administration is complicit in the secrecy. They're lying about this to the public. And indeed, the statements made from the FAA and others were inaccurate. To my knowledge, there was anomalous craft in the sky. There were attempts to bring it down, and those were unsuccessful. Some of these craft did not have traditional morphologies, et cetera. So, and we see this continuing to this day. So is there strategic signaling to the public? Is there a show of force to the authority figures? Is there an incremental revelation of their presence to us? And also potentially, and this is a question to be examined, is there a strategic shaping of the information space on NHI, right? Are there campaigns to spread certain memes and certain origin stories about certain entities and their involvement with humanity in ancient times, to write NHI into our scriptures, to trigger a revisionist history movement as we begin to imagine that maybe we were created by them. Maybe they are, the gods, the angels that have been with us all along, right? To weave them into our story. And in some ways, that would look like somewhat classical kind of colonized dynamic at play, where you enter the space, you find your chosen partners in positions of authority, right? You work through proxies. You collapse the native belief system and structure. You degrade the citizens' trust in government, and you install a new operating system. Now, I don't know if that's completely what's taking place, but there are some signs that are concerning in that regard. And again, like some folks would say, well, that's what we do. That's not what they would do. They're non-human. But they're non-humans in a human space, potentially trying to achieve human goals. They're trying to have us do things. And so it is going to play out as a human playbook to some degree. And maybe they've learned our human playbook by observing us.
What do you say to people who think that, because there does seem to be this suggestion by some people in this space that maybe they struggle to communicate with us, like they think so differently than us that but the evidence doesn't seem to back that up. There's too many cases of direct telepathy where they have no problem communicating with humans. What's your take on that?
Good question. I think there's probably multiple things at play. I would imagine there's multiple entities at play with different degrees of telepathy, very different cognitive consciousness from one another. I would imagine that some class of NHI are able to effectively communicate telepathically quite easily with human beings. I don't know what it took to achieve that. Did it take 1,000-year observation to scoop up our data, to learn our languages, or not? Maybe not at all. I do think also, of the account of Dan Sherman and others, that the U.S. government was tasked with creating a class of communicators that could interface with the non-human intelligence to enable the coordination. So that's interesting. That suggests that it was a project actually to prepare a human mind to effectively receive and transmit information. I don't fully know the nature of how NHI communicate, certainly. But at this point in the game, I would imagine that they've cracked the code on our cognition, our languages, and not just our languages, our cognitive code, our emotional code, and potentially even mimicry of the spiritual code, the what moves and inspires, engenders trust, forms tight bonds. All of this kind of the intangibles of human relationship have probably been detected in their fundamental neurological, neurochemical basis. And who knows, maybe scripts have been written, right? Algorithms have been devised to trigger those sensations and those experiences. Certainly many abductees have reported positive experiences. The question is the overall encounter positive? Is it lawful? Does it honor, their basic right to free will and sovereignty? And can we really trust the kind of the surface level assessment of quote positivity? Can we go by what feels good, or do we have to look deeper than that? Now, of course, there's many experiencers who have reported having extraordinarily traumatic events, but overall, many experiencers would say that their life was transformed through this event. So the nature of that transformation seems to suggest a certain degree of power over the whole neurochemical, neurological, switchboard that operates our cognition and our consciousness. So before we leap to assessing it as a consciousness raising, patently benevolent experience, I think we have to really step back and analyze the data and take a more encyclopedic and holistic approach to assessing encounters.
What do you think we can do from here to speed up or accelerate disclosure? Because I think you would agree with me that not having a global conversation is unacceptable. It's putting us in a bad place, because if open contact is inevitable, then the sooner we have this conversation, the sooner we can prepare for the dynamics of that open contact scenario. To postpone disclosure and keep the UFO issue in the fringe, where all of our politicians and institutions are ignoring it, that's costing us time, that's costing us strategy, so it can't be good for human civilization. So what can we do to, as an example, ensure that the Trump administration discloses before their term is up? I can't think of could we be in a better situation, a more advantageous situation to get the Trump administration, which just happens to be the administration right now, to open up and be transparent with the public? I don't think so. The sitting Secretary of State has talked about the cover-up and how this is real. And even the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, John Ratcliffe, has talked about how this is real. He said that we can't replicate this technology, and that we can't even defend against it. So you have all these high-level people that have admitted to it. What's left to get the administration to stop lying to the public and to get these disinformation campaigns to stop their activities?
Right. Well, I don't know what'll get the administration to act. The calculus is a tricky one. I know getting society ready is a big problem. That's apparently, per Hal Puthoff, why the private conference deemed that disclosure couldn't happen, is because there's just no way to not upend the global system with this. So I think there's an on-ramp. We have to prepare society. We have to normalize the conversation. We have to engage faith communities and religious leaders to help onboard their populations ontologically, but in a way that preserves, I would say, the cultural asset of what these religions are, and not allow for co-optation or a critical slide into basically making the phenomenon part of what God is or what the angels are, etc. So I don't advocate the angelic demonic framing of this. I think it's unhelpful. I think society needs its own capabilities to gain intelligence into the phenomenon. So we need to corroborate claims made by any government. Any government leader could say anything. Do we believe it? Is it true? It'll divide half the world no matter what. So it's not enough already that a government leader discloses. I have my disclosure equation, that disclosure equals trust times source times essentially contents or information. So what's the contents said by who and with what degree of trust? Well, trust is declining day by day. And so I think, government can take a step to confirm the discourse that's already taking place globally that needs to expand. To rely on a government and its defense community to disclose the nature of reality on behalf of the human interest is too much to ask. So really articulating a human interest, framing out the intergovernmental dialogue that needs to begin, that's a focus that I'm working on with an organization called the Human Institute, which is taking a truly human-first, humanitarian approach with this issue. So I think that's, I work on it every day, and it's going to be a heavy lift. It's going to take some time. But generating data as well is really important. There are data sets that do not currently exist. We still online here? Oh, good. Okay.
Yep.
There are data sets that may not exist yet that we need to create. So, for example, what are the characteristic profiles of what are being described as abductions? We have to take it out of subjectivity and place it in the domain of objectivity, of really solid, well-curated data that tells a clear story. It may not be definitive proof, but it may be sufficient indication to trigger the response by authority figures and decision makers. So I think there's work to be done there. I think we need a truth and reconciliation program en masse. We need to hear from those both within the program and outside of it. We need to hear from those who have been physically engaged by the phenomenon. So there has to be a new forum, kind of the forum of our human future, to take into account all these tracks of how we would deal with or contend with a non-human factor and how we would process its impact on human lives, human interests. So standing that up would be important. There's a lot of existing human capability to deal with stuff like this. There are organizations that deal with technology controls, human trafficking, human rights, the application of law internationally, right? What governs international waters, right? And so forth. So there's so much that could be targeted at this issue. I think if nothing else, if the Trump administration can affirm existence and presence, then society will unpack activity and intent. And in some ways, we can't really rely on one military industrial group to tell us everything we need to know about them. We have to do our own work to understand that. And I really believe that the citizens contain the larger record of what the NHI engagement has historically been. So I don't necessarily want to know or trust only what the CIA says intent is. I want to hear from people. I want to hear what has been done with and to them. That is a critical dimension to the conversation.
Yeah, the abduction part is like probably one of the best ways to, at least in theory, to ascertain what their intent is, because it's arguably the most radical activity that these non-human intelligences are reportedly doing. And it's a real shame that we don't have smoking gun evidence. And I think the fact that we don't have smoking gun evidence facilitates this topic being on the fringe, because people just roll their eyes at it, even though I think there's a very significant degree of preponderance of evidence, even if it's not smoking gun. And, the whole abduction situation, I mean, that is a conversation we really should be having globally. We should have all our best minds looking at whatever data we can get from experiencer reports to figure out why they're doing that, because that seems to be potentially that's potentially the most critical question, even more so than why are they interfering with nuclear weapons and surveilling nuclear weapons.
Yeah, you go to the point of closest and most intimate impact on human lives. That's how you really understand the full or the deepest point of penetration and the goals of whatever the engagement program is. Hovering over facilities, you could read that many different ways. Taking someone out of their home and performing the following 3 procedures, one of which is reproductive, one of which is neurological, and conditioning their thinking in specific ways. Okay, now we're getting down the road in understanding what potentially the end state is that is being desired by whatever this entity or set of entities are. I'd also say, we need to expand our thinking. We're way too narrow in how we're framing this issue. Even abductions, if real, if substantiated, are a sub-phenomenon of a missing humans phenomenon. How many people are taken but not returned? How many do not survive the process, whatever the intent is, right? And, there are hundreds of thousands of missing people in this country alone every year. Let's go into the rural parts of the world, the parts where we can detect nothing. There are few laws. There's there's no application of law, even if it exists. What's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, in Western China, right? I mean, the disappearance of people, it's called human trafficking, by the way. There are millions of trafficked humans today. And we assume that that's just all criminal syndicates and has to do with drugs and prostitution, et cetera. It does. But now, and this is the responsible next step, we have got to begin accounting for the non-human factor. They are here. If Age of Disclosure landed any truth, it's that there is a presence. Now, what is the presence doing? To get that information, stop banging on the door of the Pentagon and start talking to people. That's the UFO conversation. I talk to people all the time, and I hear some pretty unbelievable stuff from people you would never thought had any experience. And there is some real shape and dimension to that story that they tell. And so, yeah, we need to expand our lens, see this not just as a human cover-up, but as a whole species engagement by multiple entities who are not just technological, but yes, telepathic. And that means they can affect the inception of thought, and thought directs communication. And therefore, we have to look at the information space to look at the narratives circulating about NHI. Some of these have the look of an engineered narrative. Some don't. Some may just be, human creative minds thinking outside the box, et cetera, speculating. But there could be intentional narratives being seeded onto social media, fueled, spread, and generating a certain kind of network of believers and apologists who would defend certain activities that really are not defendable. And I will note, in the conversation, very few people question the phenomenon. Everyone is directing all firepower at the government and the legacy program. And I think they deserve some fire. That's fine. But the real controversy here is the appearance in the early to mid 20th century of a broad, technological presence that was intending to globally engage humanity. And so I think we need to place the controversy there and really interrogate the phenomenon, not just ourselves.
Yeah, and I think the clandestine nature of the phenomenon, that's a revelation in of itself. That's not a neutral observation. And coupling that with abductions, I think intensifies that observation. Not only are they clandestine and do they prevent an open conversation, but simultaneously they're reportedly abducting people. I think there's something to be taken away from that.
Mm-hmm. And in my knowledge, from those who I've talked to, the information I have come across, abductions are happening. And anyone who knows anything about this phenomenon inside the federal space knows that that is true. So if that's the case, we have it's like, honey, we got a problem. We've got an intruder in the house. The basement of our house, we have no key. We have no access to the key, to the door. It's the ocean, right? So we have a subterranean space on Earth that can basically hide any presence, be used to operate any clandestine operation. And I think there's a urgency there that we need to take in and begin to express and put that kind of pressure on decision makers. If they hear their constituents wanting to know the nature of the human, non-human collaboration, the extent of the presence, there's an appetite for it, there's an ontological readiness to handle those truths, maybe they come out with those truths, So we need to create almost like a vacuum, like a thirst, a need to know. And the need to know is not just, hey, government, air out your laundry and tell us about the crimes you've committed, right? Oh yeah, governments are really good at doing that. But what is creating, kind of like the suction that's demanding information? I think if the controversy is on the NHI, that absolutely prefers a more unified response. If it's all about, humans are the bad guys, NHI are here, yes, but basically let's look at how we can partner with them to get free tech. That's the setup for a competitive discourse on this topic.
Do you think there's any thing that can be done to prevent abductions? And I think that's a very uncomfortable topic because there's so much bias in the discussion as we hear it now, where people assume that it's somehow it's for their benefit and we should just allow it to happen, which I think that's an incredibly, maybe it's true, I don't know, on some deep cosmic level, but it's still a very biased way to look at it, because in any other scenario, if a human being took someone out of their home and did medical procedures on them, that would be an unambiguous ethical violation. So I don't think there's anything. Not only do I not think there's anything wrong, but I think it's perfectly rational to see abductions as morally problematic. So from that standpoint, do you think there is anything people can do that are experiencing these scenarios to prevent it or stop it from reoccurring?
Yeah, well, just to your point there, to kind of reverse justify these as beneficial or as, well, the act of a higher sentience, or maybe we're being tagged and tracked, but just, as human wildlife, there's a lot of reverse justification going on there. That's not frontline thinking. You can't go before Congress and present factual information regarding abductions and back it up with, yeah, but it's not a problem because I don't know, maybe the universe knows better, right? Like, there are laws that govern nations that provide stability and justice, and those laws govern forced removal, right? They protect children in vulnerable populations, et cetera. So what are we going to abandon our whole legal framework in order to engage NHI? Now, I think we would adjust our legal framework over time. We will have to adjust. That's the long game. But the short game, we cannot just throw out our humanity and embrace the unknown as better and more knowledgeable than us. And a lot of people do. Okay. So abductions, yes, I do think there are ways to make yourself a less favorable candidate for whatever the program is. There are ways to put off both vocal and consciousness-based statements of noncompliance. And I've met many abductees who practice a form of spirituality, or kind of strong mental shielding or psychological strengthening, psi strengthening, that have effectively stopped these experiences from happening in their experience. I don't have a tried and true method to present to people. I don't have data on what works, what doesn't. I think we're at the point of just collecting the data to substantiate whether abductions are happening. So I think what society needs is that data set. Decision makers need credible research done on abductions. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, and I'm not sure who's made it so, it might be both human and non-human, there is very little hard, credible research being done on the nature of these encounters. There are support groups, there are organizations doing good work, supporting experiencers, advocating for, certain kind of medical kind of standards of care. But in terms of actually going out and figuring out what is the characteristic profile of the encounter and of the entity, to my knowledge, that's not being done right now. So it needs to be done. With that, you can then better understand, what are the variety of factors that may play into whether or not this experience happens. Everything from age, gender, ethnicity, nationality, religious disposition, political disposition, income level, history with the phenomenon, so family lineage. That's just starting off, right? So to gain insight into those dimensions would come from the data and the research, and then maybe from there, strategies can be devised to basically say, okay, to prevent X, Y, Z from happening, plug this device into your wall, right? Or put off or engage in this extremely intense practice of prayer. Right. At the moment now, it's highly subjective, anecdotal. So, but there are definitely some practices I know of that can help create a shield of protection for individuals.
Do you have any theories as to why family lineage appears to play such a big role, that if you've been abducted and you have children, your children are more likely to be abducted?
Well, first line thinking is it starts to look like a multi-generational process of creating a highly specific and potentially altered human being. I mean, we do this with plants and animal life. We hybridize different traits, different plants or animals that have different attributes that we want. We have them mate, and we replicate over multiple lineages of that species, and we end up with a different food crop or animal. So is there some effort to shape and adjust what it is to be human, to prefer certain traits, whether they're a psychological disposition, personality traits, etc. I would imagine we present a panacea of different potential humans that could be preferred one over another. Maybe they want one that's less emotional, more consistent, more intellectual, higher IQ. Maybe they have detected that certain ethnicities can withstand certain pressures off planet in adverse environments over others. I'm only speculating here, but there's about a million different things you could select for. And then, over multiple lineages, you could actually functionally attain an entity that is slightly distinct from others. And, this is where we have to get about figuring out what's going on, because we may wake up in 100 years and not be the humans we were. And it wasn't malevolence. It was contact with the ecosystem. It was ecology, essentially. Life forms adapt as the environment changes. Well, our environment is changing. And now we are dealing, however, with intentional designers, potentially, of environment. So that could be a reason. To be honest, I actually don't have a great deal of insight into the kind of the family lineage aspect of the why, but I am aware that is a well-acknowledged aspect for experiencers, runs in the family.
Yeah, and it's definitely should be looked at as a potential clue as to what's going on, and not just.
I'll add just one thing that I wouldn't be surprised if there is a concerted effort to profile the human population, looking for psychic abilities, psychic openness, channels by which information can enter and exit, and abilities that can be leveraged, almost like you put CPUs in racks and make a server farm. You deploy these computational systems to exert themselves to solve complex problems. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if human minds can be strung together psionically and used as leverage against key problems. And, part of that might be an interest in the earth, technologies that have been deposited on the earth, and gaining access to those. And I think, individuals with a certain degree of telepathy might play a part in providing that new capability set, whether it's for on-planet uses or off-planet uses.
Yeah, and I think one of the negatives of the conversation today is it's just too abstract and philosophical, but you take a completely different route as illuminated by what you just said. Like, we really need to look into what might be more plausible and what the implications are of what's happening, as opposed to, we can't understand this, it's beyond our grasp, it's spiritual, but okay.
See, Ryan, this is the exact thing that called me into this field, is everyone was saying we can't know. And what I would say is, there are degrees of knowability already in our possession that we are not acknowledging or claiming. We have 80 years of evidence, tens of thousands of human observations of the phenomenon. You cannot tell me we cannot know. And in the same breath, say we need the government to disclose. That puts all the power back in the hands of the power brokers. It disempowers the citizens, as they have been, and it puts us in this cloud of unknowing, which is where this field has been for so long. And so, what is it that we can know? And part of that is bounding the endless possibilities into a zone of probable explanations for the program at hand that is non-human in origin. And I think it's not 10 things, it's 3 or 4. So, and if we can bound that zone, then we can deploy our limited resources to go out into the field and get the data to corroborate which scenario is actually the one at play. But if we don't move in that incremental kind of procedural, response-driven process, if we're all about just expanding into the endless possibilities of the universe, or knowing what's happening with the scientific method alone, we will be frozen. That's paralysis by analysis.
Yeah, and that's why I think your voice is so important in this conversation, because you are taking an approach that, from what I can tell, is not very common. And I think that's a byproduct of the UFO community not seeing the situation as a problem. They see it more as like an adventure. And I'm not saying that's the wrong approach necessarily, but we need balance. It's not just an adventure, it's a problem. And it's a problem because there are non-human intelligences engaging our world, and we don't know why they're here, or we also don't know why they're doing what they're doing. So we really need, so if you don't see it as a problem and you purely see it as an abstraction, you're never going to get into the more serious conversation of trying to discern what is actually happening. And I also think that, as you were saying, if you come from the perspective that you can't figure anything out, well, then you're already starting from a self-defeating posture. So you're just going to naturally gravitate toward the abstract, because if you try to look at it in a more objective way, you're going to say, "Oh, we can't do that. That's against the rules, and it's not going to come to any meaningful end anyway. So let's avoid that." But no, the UFO community needs to focus more of its attention, in my opinion, on your approach. And the other question I have is, do you think disclosure itself presents any problems? Because we've heard from David Grush, he apparently came across some people who gave him the impression that there might have been some agreements made by the U.S. government, and then disclosure could cause problems, because maybe part of the agreement was you do not disclose, and if you do not disclose, we'll give you X, Y, Z. And then there's another. I'll leave it at that. I'll let you address that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we have to ask the question: who's really behind the opposition to disclosure? It may not be purely, the human cover-up. The non-human factor may be at play in actually preventing it, mandating that it not occur. And we might be seeing a breakaway faction of individuals who have seen enough, they've gotten enough information about the phenomenon and what it's done and what it's actually doing, and how it might be violating those kinds of agreements. And that's why, if this doesn't get out soon, a whole set of undesirable outcomes might ensue. So, I think the phenomenon has demonstrated an intention to not disclose. There's an intentional, covert nature to the operation that has been clearly demonstrated. Individuals, you could say, have been given information, but that's under captivity, right? You can't take an abductee and say, "Here's a beautiful vision of your future, go home and share it." And that person says, "Well, they disclosed their intention to me." Yeah, what was their intention for removing you from your home at night, right? So we have to read that with a grain of salt too. In my view, broad, immediate disclosure of non-human intelligence is absolutely the necessity. We need to disclose NHI more than we need to disclose our government's secret programs. Governments don't disclose secret programs. They never have. They never will. That's not what governments are. So we're working upstream from the get-go there. If we can cast our eyes to the non-human factor and really interrogate its foundations and question its activity, which few people seem willing to do. There seems to be a broad blanket non-willingness to question activity and intent, which is a total head scratcher to me. That says to me that there may be some effort at social engineering underway to predispose people's thinking, their perception, to create kind of a self-imposed barrier emotionally, to really asking hard questions that yield answers. And I'm curious as to what could break through that barrier.
Adding to that, you just made me think that maybe this is speculation, but maybe one of the reasons they operate exactly the way they do is because they're trying to create a mythology. School landings, occasionally being seen in close proximity by various people. Well, what does that do? It mythologizes the phenomenon. And then it almost seduces the populace to start focusing on the mythology or the spiritual aspects, but not the aspects that you're talking about. So we could speculate that the way they operate is done to intentionally to get those that know it's here to speak of it in exactly the ways you said we should be moving away from.
Right. Yeah. So if you want to keep people, their eyes and their hands off of dealing with the hard physical reality, to your point, Ryan, it's a great one. You create a new mythology of how NHI has been ever present, interacting with humanity. They've always been here. They may even be from here. They may have co-indigenous rights to the earth. That just, those kinds of initial conclusions, which to me, there's no evidence to back up those conclusions, first off. I'm not ruling them out, but they cannot be ruled in at this point. But that absolutely creates and erects a containment barrier around the human response, right? We're not talking about diplomacy and forced removal of NHI or applying laws upon NHI for what they're doing to human beings. No, man, we have to expand out of that's primitive thinking. We have to expand into a spiritualistic, higher consciousness realm of possibilities. It actually puts.
And so you're saying they might have engineered that tendency when people talk about the phenomenon. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that tendency of thought absolutely predisposes a very specific set of human responses and denies us the ability to respond to the hard physical phenomenon, right? You know, when a bullet is fired in a neighborhood, what do? We go in there, we find out where it was fired from, what kind of bullet, from what gun, trace the gun. Like, it's hard physical forensics. But we are not going to do that if we basically internally separate from that kind of grounded line of thinking to one that is more spiritual, mythological, to your point, or metaphysical, and we center the phenomenon there. So is there an effort to shift people really off their former footings onto a new set of footings that then it kind of, you know, there could be something at play where, like, there's an attempt to get us into a game in which other entities not only have all the chips, but the game works alongside their strengths, right? How do you affect 7 billion minds if you're a force of, I don't know, 3 or 4,000 entities with, 500 craft and several interstellar facilities on bodies in our solar system? What do? You affect, right, basic perception, sense of self and belonging, right? You create the predecessor to ideation, and then the ideas flow naturally and then are expressed. And you create a container where those kinds of mythologies or metaphysical statements of reality can be expressed and are welcome to be expressed. At the same time, no one wants to hear from someone who's talking about dealing with hard physical impacts on human health and interests. That's primitive thinking. We need to elevate. We need to expand our consciousness, right? And so you create a game, and you create coins and currency that work inside that game that play to your strengths, not to ours. So I think there could be some 4D chess going on here, and we're playing 2D chess, and we're just imagining things, and we have no idea the impact of the thoughts we're thinking and how that affects other minds. So, yeah, I think this is how we reshift the discourse, and I appreciate, Ryan, your great thinking and analysis. I appreciate your wit and the comedy that comes with it, but also just the ability to get into the fight and think hard and clear about the implications of this.
Well, I love your bullet metaphor. I think that really drives home what you're getting at. That we wouldn't, if someone fired a weapon and it was a stray bullet, the entire police department would be trying to engineer where did it come from and why was it fired and who's responsible for it. But then we have UFOs here, we have non-human intelligences here, we have abductions here, and yet it seems like the overarching thrust of the conversation within ufology is abstraction, which I'm not saying there's not a place for that, but I think you're a good counter to that potential excessiveness. Now, if there was, to play devil's advocate, if someone in the intelligence community said to you, look, Reed, I understand you think we should be talking about this more within human population, but if this disclosure ever happened, whether it happened from governments or from civilian population, the non-human intelligences would have more avenues to influence humanity's beliefs, behaviors, and trajectory. What would you say to that?
Well, I know there is a tacit kind of belief that NHI, well, first off, are able to retaliate in broad ways, which is itself alarming when you hear defense agency leads and military IC people saying they're afraid of NHI retaliating. It's like, okay, what game are we in now? I don't know if I see that risk, and in fact, if I were the NHI, I would want to impose that kind of dissuasion upon human actors to say, don't you be disclosing, because little do you know, we could trigger a massive CME or fake one and take down human civilization. I'm hearing conjecture like that. And so I think, that's something to be considered. Now, your question's a really good one. So if we disclose that gives NHI more ability to influence the thinking of the population, I would say absolutely not. I would say clear, articulate disclosure with data, not just of NHI, which could be anything, non-human intelligence. No, the physical, biological sentiences piloting these craft. Those are the words of David Grush last week on Fox News. The sentient biological intelligences piloting these craft. If you articulate that to the public, that then frames the public's thinking. Right now they're thinking of, okay, they're biological. They're under the pressure of evolution. They might be here to compete. They might be here because they're interested in the planet or some resource or something like that. We should be cautious. We should mandate that they disclose their intentions before they access the planet. Then maybe we need a diplomatic mission off planet. So they meet us in space or on the moon, not here, right? And then we need disclosure as to their presence in the solar system and all of its orbital bodies, right? And so the thinking down selects to very clear, actionable, unifying, actually, kind of principled actions. Without that, with this left in the murk, people could be getting thoughts and impulses, emotional activation or suppression, and not know where it's coming from. And, it is possible. We can already do it ourselves. We can influence consciousness and perception through technologies that trigger certain brain structures, brain centers, and we can do it with a device that sits on your head. Now, but what if the device was powered at an unbelievable level such that it could be a mile away? Could you influence the thinking and emotions and the actual perception of population centers, not just individual people? Without any broad disclosure of this, that's the risk we run, is a quiet social engineering that could be undertaken at many different levels. And that's why I would say, if you do not disclose, if I may hypothetically speak right to the deep state right now, I would say, if you don't disclose to the public now, you lose the war. You could think you can win the battle. You think you can down the craft, but you lose the war because you lose the population. And ultimately, it's about hearts and minds. And if you give up on the value of retaining the hearts and minds of your own human brothers and sisters and think that you can win this in secret, you've lost. That's my opinion. So we have to stay on the human, this is really a humanity first effort. It's about what humanity needs done in the context of present or future forms of contact. And if we lose the allegiance of our own kind, our basic trust in one another and in the structures of civilization that we can create organically, and we basically submit ourselves to whatever comes and whatever it wills to install here, I think we are really putting on the line our basic humanity.
I tend to agree with that, and what you just stated makes me think of slide 9 from ATIP, as they were concerned that people within governance could be influenced psychologically by the phenomenon and therefore inject decisions.
I'm reading it right now, actually. I've got it right on my desktop.
Go ahead and read it.
The science exists for an enemy of the United States to manipulate both physical and cognitive environments in order to penetrate U.S. facilities, influence decision makers, and compromise national security. Psychotronic weapons, cognitive human interface, penetration of solid surfaces, instantaneous sensor disassembly, alteration, manipulation of biological organisms, anomalies in the space-time construct, and unique cognitive human interface experiencers. What was considered phenomena is now quantum physics. ATIP subfocus area. Yeah.
And I if you don't worry about that, then you're really ignoring possibilities. I mean, if there are beings here engaging clandestinely and abducting people, then it's not a bridge too far to say that do you really think they're going to say to themselves, we have all these technologies, we could influence people, but we're going to hold back on that. We're just going to abduct people because influencing them would be going too far and would be out of bounds for our ethical framework. I mean, yeah, it's possible, but it's also very possible that if they're willing to abduct people clandestinely and erase their memories as much as they can, then what would stop them from influencing people in our world to do things that they want them to do.
Yeah. I mean, it makes total sense. And for those who feel like that's too much threat for them to handle, okay, just pause that for a second. And I know for the public, how are they going to deal with that? That's the next question. The way I would see it is we have encountered another form of life that has an interest in us or the planet or attributes of the planet. They're going to look at us and they're not going to be happy with what they see, probably, right? They're going to want to influence or alter the trajectory that humanity is on. Now, they, whatever that is, may think that they're doing us a favor or that they're acting in a beneficial intent. I wouldn't be surprised if they do. And so they're going to use their full set of capabilities to penetrate the Earth human system, to identify levers that work to effectively alter human behavior according to those ends, and they will enact their capabilities upon those levers. They will leverage them, and they will cause changes in culture, religion, technology, and how technology is deployed, etc., the composition of power in the world, right? They will want to alter the landscape. They will not be immediately satisfied with the human landscape that they find. That is not malevolence. That is intent. Now, we have to negotiate that intent with our own. In fact, we have to articulate our intent. Now, one of the ways I would articulate human intent, because that looks quite challenging, right? 192 countries, many different religious kind of frameworks for understanding life, many political models. Well, 3 words: stability, security, and sovereignty. With those 3, many cultural, religious, and political projects can be undertaken. You can have a Chinese political project, you can have an American political project, a Catholic, a Muslim, etc. Stability, security, and sovereignty, and the preservation of the free will and the right to act with one's own sentience guiding the process, with, the right to select and identify one's life journey and to take it forward, right? That's pretty all-encompassing. So we have to take an intent like that and look at a non-human intent, and they have to petition, right, for access and for the ability to enact their intent with our permission, right? There has to be a sovereign framework by which we mediate this presence. And if we forego that right, if we take those chips off the bargaining table and say we have no chips, they have all the chips, right? Why would we do that? That doesn't make any sense to me. So, if it looks like a threat, that's fine. If you want to frame it as risk and hazard, that's fine too. Or just competing intents in an ecology in which there are multiple forms of life interested in the same planet, resources, biology, etc.
Yeah, and I think a useful way to frame it is that for all we know, humanity in 10,000 years will start exploring other worlds, and we might start doing exactly what the presence is doing to us. We might try to influence other worlds, how we
Wouldn't
think,
we? Right?
How we think we
if
want
they had something we wanted, they wouldn't give it to us, at first glance, wouldn't we want to influence them to do so? Right.
Yeah. Or maybe even if resources had nothing to do with it, maybe we thought we knew it was best for them. So we want to nudge them in certain directions according to how we perceive what a good trajectory entails. Reed, this was a great interview. I really appreciate it. Say whatever you want to say that maybe you haven't said, and and after that, tell people where to find your platform.
I love that invitation to say whatever I want to say. Well,
take as long as you want.
Okay, here we go. Who's got my soapbox? Well, it's been a pleasure, Ryan. I appreciate your platform. And as you kind of walk with the discourse and deconstruct all of the events taking place, I think we need to bring logic and caution to the conversation. We need to think in a human-centered fashion, not gaslight ourselves in the presence of supersentiences and think that we don't know anything. We do know some things. And we have fought tooth nail to survive on this earth and to get this far. And I think we have a right to some kind of sovereign place on this planet and the ability to continue the human project without being, intervened with. So I think to anchor into that is important. That's my work over at my podcast, Emergent. I'm basically walking around this human-non-human interface, looking at all the dimensions of politics, technology, environment, religion and spirituality, basically examining how have the non-human and the human come together, and how do we begin to assess the implications of that. So with that, I've launched a platform called Forerunner for those who want to have this frontline conversation often and with one another to responsibly speculate on the front lines of the phenomenon. So you can head over to readsummers.com/forerunner to join that platform. With that, I'm also working intensively with an organization called the Human Institute. And so the UAP Detection and Tracking Summit is being sponsored by the Human Institute. It's very affordable to attend. We're hoping to bring in not only decision makers and the science and research crowd, but you, the citizens. So if you want to be a part of a society-led conversation on detecting and tracking UAP and generating tactical awareness of what these craft are doing, where, and potentially ultimately why, please join the summit. Spots are limited, and look forward to having you. I'm also working on launching a platform called UFOevidence.com, where we will score and methodically present evidence to the public on key aspects of the phenomenon. It's going to be a pretty groundbreaking site. We're looking for early adopters. So if you're interested in that, drop me a line at info@readsummers.com, and I'd be happy to connect you with the team. And then finally, I'm chairing a series of lectures and panels on investigating non-human intelligence. We have Dr. Gary Nolan giving the next lecture in the series, talking about the research roadmap for investigating NHI. And then we have lots of other great thought leaders, scientists, researchers, and investigators coming on, to basically move the needle, crack the nut, figure out what's inside this enigma, and do so with the best of science. So highly encourage you to watch the lectures. They're free and open to the public. That's over at Human Institute/NHI. And with that, look for me on Twitter, LinkedIn, medium.com. I'm working on a book right now, which will be out soon and available to the public, hopefully free. I'm going to make that available just publicly, put it out there on intent, because I think if we're dealing with intelligence, intelligence has an intent, and we have to begin to decode that using the signals available to us. So with that, it's great to be here and share another good conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Reed.
Yeah, Ryan. Yep. Hope you're well, and keep going. Keep up the good fight.